The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. The city outside was alive, the muffled sounds of traffic and distant voices filtering through the thin walls. But inside, it was just me and Ryan. It was always just me and Ryan lately. Living with someone changes things. You see every side of them, the good, the bad, and the unexpected. Ryan had been my roommate for almost a year now, and in that time, I'd learned more about him than I ever expected. He was neat, but not obsessive, easygoing, but not lazy. He had a way of filling a room with his presence without even trying, a quiet confidence that made people gravitate toward him. I told myself from the start not to overthink the way I felt around him. Ryan was the kind of guy who made everyone feel like they were the only person in the room. It didn't mean anything, except sometimes it felt like it did. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling aimlessly on my phone while Ryan stood in the kitchen, making himself a late-night snack. The overhead light cast a warm glow across the space, highlighting the curve of his shoulders as he leaned against the counter. He was wearing a faded t-shirt that clung to his back and a pair of sweatpants that hung low on his hips. I looked away, heat rising in my chest. "Want anything?" he called over his shoulder, his voice breaking the silence. I shook my head before realizing he couldn't see me. "No, I'm good." He glanced back, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. "You sure? You barely ate at dinner." "I'm fine," I said, a little too quickly. Ryan shrugged and turned back to the counter, but I could feel his eyes lingering for a moment longer than necessary. I hated how aware I was of him. The way his presence seemed to pull at the edges of my attention no matter how hard I tried to focus on anything else. The way his laugh made my stomach flip. The way he always seemed so comfortable in his own skin, like he'd never once questioned who he was or what he wanted. It was the kind of confidence I envied. When Ryan came back to the living room, he plopped down on the couch next to me, too close as always. He carried a plate of toast with some kind of spread I couldn't quite identify. He took a bite and then held the plate out to me, his eyebrows raised in a silent offer. I shook my head. I said I'm fine. "You're always fine," he teased, leaning back against the cushions. "One day you'll surprise me and admit you actually want something." His words were light, playful, but they struck a nerve. I stared at the screen of my phone, my grip tightening slightly. "Maybe I just don't want what you think I do," I muttered. Ryan paused, his eyes flicking to me. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said quickly, regretting the words as soon as they left my mouth. He set the plate down on the coffee table, his attention fully on me now. "You're acting weird tonight." "I'm not," I said, but my voice sounded defensive even to my own ears. Ryan tilted his head, studying me with that infuriatingly perceptive look of his. "You are. You've been weird all week, actually." I shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "I've just been busy with work, that's all." "Uh-huh." He didn't sound convinced, but he let it drop, much to my relief. He leaned back against the couch, stretching his arms along the backrest. One of his hands brushed against my shoulder, the contact light but enough to send a jolt through me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "You're tense," he said, his voice softening. "I'm not." Ryan didn't move his hand and I didn't pull away. The space between us felt smaller than it had a moment ago. The air charged with something I didn't want to name. "Do you ever stop pretending?" he asked suddenly. His question caught me off guard, and I turned to look at him, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" Ryan's eyes held mine, steady and unflinching. "You're always holding something back. I don't know what it is, but it's like you're afraid to just be." "That's ridiculous," I said, but my voice wavered. "Is it?" The way he was looking at me made my chest tighten. His hand was still resting lightly on my shoulder, the heat of his skin seeping through my shirt. I wanted to pull away, to break the moment before it spiraled into something I couldn't control, but I couldn't make myself move. Ryan's hand didn't move, but the weight of it was suffocating. I felt like every nerve in my body was attuned to that single point of contact, the warmth of his palm bleeding through my shirt and into my skin. He wasn't doing anything, not really, just sitting there, too close, his eyes locked on mine as if waiting for me to say something, to admit something. I couldn't. "I'm not holding anything back," I said, the words clipped and defensive. Ryan's lips quirked into a small, knowing smile, but he didn't call me out on the lie. "If you say so." His fingers shifted slightly, the movement subtle but enough to send a shiver racing down my spine. I hated how easily he got under my skin, how effortlessly he seemed to unravel me without even trying. It wasn't fair. "You don't have to pretend around me, you know," he said after a moment. His voice was softer now, almost gentle. "I'm not going to judge you." The words hit harder than they should have. My throat tightened and I looked away, focusing on the dark screen of the TV. I could see our reflections there, distorted and blurred, but the proximity between us was unmistakable. "There's nothing to pretend about," I muttered, but even I didn't believe it. Ryan didn't reply right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his hand dropping from my shoulder to rest on the back of the couch. "You're bad at this," he said, his tone light but edged with something deeper. "Bad at what?" "Lying. You're terrible at it." I turned to glare at him, heat rising in my chest. "I'm not lying." Ryan's eyes searched mine, and for a moment the teasing grin slipped from his face. What replaced it was something quieter, more serious. His gaze dropped briefly. To my mouth I realized with a jolt, before flicking back to meet my eyes. "Okay," he said softly, "then tell me what's really going on with you." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words tangled in my throat. What could I say? That I'd spent the past few months trying to ignore the way he made me feel. That every casual touch, every sideways glance had become a battle not to give myself away. That I hated and wanted him in equal measure, and I didn't know how to reconcile those two truths. "Nothing's going on," I said finally, the lie bitter on my tongue. Ryan didn't look convinced, but he didn't press. Instead, he leaned back, his arm brushing against mine as he stretched out across the couch. The casualness of the movement was almost insulting, like he knew exactly what he was doing but was pretending it didn't mean anything. "Fine," he said. "Keep pretending." I turned back to the TV, my jaw clenched tight. The room felt too small, the air too heavy, and I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye. Minutes passed in silence, each one stretching longer than the last. I tried to focus on the muted hum of the city outside, on the faint sounds of the fridge in the kitchen, on anything but the weight of Ryan's presence beside me. It didn't work. "You know," he said suddenly, breaking the silence, "you're not as hard to read as you think you are." I tensed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ryan shrugged, his arm brushing against mine again. "You're always so careful, like you're afraid of letting anyone get too close. That's not true, isn't it?" His tone was maddeningly calm, like he was dissecting me piece by piece. I turned to glare at him, but the intensity in his gaze stopped me short. He was closer than I realized, his eyes locked on mine with a focus that made my pulse spike. "You don't have to be afraid," he said quietly. The words sent a shiver through me, and I hated how much I wanted to believe him. "I'm not afraid," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Ryan tilted his head, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're lying again." "I'm not." Before I could finish, he shifted closer, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was light, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt through me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and Ryan didn't move. He just sat there, his hand resting against mine, his eyes searching mine for something. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I couldn't. The air between us felt electric, the tension so thick I could hardly breathe. My mind screamed at me to say something, to pull away, but my body betrayed me. I stayed rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest as Ryan's hand shifted, his fingers brushing against mine in a way that felt deliberate. Just say the word, he said, his voice even softer now, and I'll stop. But I didn't. Ryan's hand moved slowly, his fingers curling around mine. The warmth of his touch sent a flush of heat through me, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into something I couldn't take back. I knew it, he murmured, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I looked at him sharply. Knew what? That you felt it, too. My stomach flipped. Don't lie, he said, cutting me off. His grip on my hand tightened slightly, grounding me. You don't have to lie anymore. The words unraveled something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I turned fully to face him. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the world outside the room ceased to exist. And then he leaned in. The kiss was tentative at first, his lips brushing against mine so lightly it could have been mistaken for an accident. But it wasn't. The contact sent a jolt through me, and my hands gripped the edge of the couch as though I might fall. Ryan didn't pull back. His hand moved to cup my jaw, his thumb brushing against my cheek in a way that was both gentle and possessive. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, and I felt myself sinking into it, into him. When we finally broke apart, our breaths mingling in the quiet, Ryan's hand lingered on my face. His eyes searched mine, and for the first time, I saw something raw and unguarded there. You don't have to pretend anymore, he said softly. I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding, my mind a whirlwind, but in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to look away. Ryan's hand remained on my face, his touch steady and grounding as the silence stretched between us. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, the rush of blood in my ears drowning out every coherent thought. His eyes stayed on mine, unwavering, and it was as if he was daring me to speak, to break the moment. But I couldn't. Every part of me felt frozen, locked in place by the gravity of what had just happened. My lips still tingled from the kiss, and the warmth of his breath lingered in the space between us. You okay? He asked softly, his voice pulling me back to the present. I swallowed hard, nodding slightly. I think so. Ryan's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. His thumb traced an absent-minded line along my cheekbone, and the gentle motion sent a shiver racing down my spine. I didn't mean to push you, he said, his voice low, but I couldn't. He stopped himself, shaking his head. You couldn't what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His gaze dropped for a moment, his hand slipping from my face. I couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore. The honesty in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd spent so long convincing myself that the tension between us was one-sided, that whatever I felt was my burden to bear alone. But hearing him say it, admit it, made everything feel sharper, more real. I don't know how to do this, I admitted, my voice trembling. Ryan's eyes lifted to meet mine, and there was something steadying in his gaze. You don't have to know, he said. We'll figure it out. The simplicity of his words made my chest tighten. He said it like it was easy, like the world outside this apartment wouldn't matter, like we could just exist in this bubble forever. I wished I could believe him. Ryan shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. The contact was small, barely more than a whisper of touch, but it grounded me in a way I hadn't expected. His hand found mine again, his fingers curling around mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. You don't have to say anything, he said after a moment. Not right now. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. For the next few minutes we sat there in silence, the quiet between us no longer heavy but fragile, as though a single wrong move might shatter it. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, but he didn't push, didn't ask for more than I was ready to give. When I finally found my voice, it was soft, almost hesitant. This changes everything, doesn't it? Ryan tilted his head, his lips curving into a faint smile. Maybe it doesn't have to. How could it not? His thumb brushed over my knuckles, his touch deliberate and slow. "Because it's still us," he said simply. "That hasn't changed." His words lingered in the air, wrapping around me like a balm against the storm of emotion swirling in my chest. I wanted to believe him, wanted to let myself sink into the comfort of his certainty. But doubt clung to me like a shadow. "What if we ruin this?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Ryan's smile softened and he leaned in, his forehead brushing against mine. "I'd rather risk ruining it than spend my life wondering what we could have had." The vulnerability in his words shattered something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned forward, capturing his lips in another kiss. This one was different. Deeper, hungrier. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping tightly as though I might lose him if I let go. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and the world outside blurred into nothingness. I lost track of time, lost myself in the warmth of his body against mine, the steady rhythm of his breathing grounding me even as everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads pressed together. "Tell me you don't regret this," Ryan said, his voice barely audible. I hesitated, the weight of his question pressing down on me. My mind was a tangle of fear and uncertainty, but in that moment, the truth felt impossible to ignore. "I don't," I said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't regret it." Relief flickered across his face and he smiled, a real smile this time, warm and genuine. "Good," he said, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "Because I don't either." We sat there for what felt like hours, tangled together on the couch, the quiet between us no longer daunting, but comforting. For the first time in months, the tension that had always hovered just beneath the surface was gone, replaced by something softer, something real. When Ryan finally pulled back, his expression was serious but tender. "I don't want to mess this up," he said. "Neither do I." His smile returned, and he pressed a quick kiss to my forehead before standing and offering me his hand. "Come on," he said. "Where?" He grinned. "Bed. You look like you're about to pass out." The suggestion was innocent enough, but the warmth in his eyes sent a flush creeping up my neck. I took his hand, letting him pull me to my feet, and together we made our way to his room. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the blinds felt too bright, too intrusive. I blinked against it, the events of the night before crashing down on me like a tidal wave. Ryan was still asleep beside me, his face relaxed and peaceful in the soft morning light. For a moment, I let myself just look at him, memorizing the curve of his jaw, the faint lines around his eyes, the way his hair fell messily across his forehead. It felt like the calm before the storm. When his eyes fluttered open, a sleepy smile spread across his face. "Morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my chest tightening. The weight of what we'd done, of what it meant, pressed down on me, but as Ryan reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine, some of the tension eased. Whatever came next, we'd face it together.